right?
Oh,
Which is
no.
what you're talking about. And that has to do with getting
Right.
more grants and more federal funding. And the whole university worked its ass off. We made a big announcement last year, and now it's suddenly like, oh, that's the wrong thing to be. Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm V.V. Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
When I was just out of high school in 1987, those are painful words to say, there was this huge book that came out predicting the end of American education. The Closing of the American Mind by Allen Bloom. You remember it?
I was 7, so I don't remember it, but I've heard of the book, and I've certainly heard of Allen Bloom, who, as I recall, taught at Yale and Cornell and maybe like the University of Chicago, among other places.
Here's my copy for the YouTube watchers. I still have it with my underlining. I've been thinking a lot about that book because it really was a huge hit. I mean, it says #1 bestseller. Here's the New York Times. Remarkable. Hits with the approximate force and effect of electroshock therapy. Which doesn't actually sound like a compliment. I'm not sure that it is. Anyway. I mean, Saul Bellow wrote the foreword to this book. And these days we're watching the Trump administration threaten universities like Columbia, where Trump recently threatened to cut access to $400 million in federal contracts and grants, a sort of case that's still playing out.
And talk about the closing of the American mind, lowercase.
Yeah. Okay, but here's the complicated thing. I feel like conservative writers like Bloom and Bellow and Bill Kristol, who reviewed The Closing of the American Mind positively, would oppose the way that Trump is attacking universities now. And yet their arguments in the 1980s and earlier may have set the stage for the end of the university as we know it, in my personal view.
Well, it's a good thing that today we're joined by Meghan O'Rourke, who just wrote an essay for the New York Times called The End of the University as We Know It. Meghan is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction, as well as The Long Goodbye and the poetry collections Sun in Days, Once, and Half-Life. Her writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and The New York Times, as well as many others. She's the recipient of a Guggenheim, a Radcliffe, as well as a Whiting Nonfiction Award, and she resides in New Haven, where she is a professor of creative writing at Yale University, as well as the editor of the Yale Review. Meghan, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're very happy that you could join us. We all teach at universities. I'm in the process of going through applications for our MFA program. You and Sugi were just out in LA, I think, for AWP. Which celebrates creative writing programs at universities across the country. So universities are still here. Our incoming students certainly expect them to be here for at least 3 more years. Or at least that's how long our program is. So why are you telling them the university is going to end?
Okay, well, there's 2 things here. First of all, there's a kind of pun in the title, or a double entendre rather than a pun. In the end of the university, I offer a history of what the goals of the university, the research university in particular, were, which were to advance strategic national interest, especially since the Cold War. The other thing I'm talking about when I say the end of the university is that I argue that the research university as it has existed in America since the 1940s, and by that we mean what's called the Cold War University, a university that had federal funds poured into it, might be about to disappear. So I don't mean that there won't be students next year, although note that in many places, or rather in some places, there will be no incoming graduate students. That has been announced. What is might disappear, or is threatening to disappear, is the long-standing idea that the federal government ought to help fund university research without overbearing federal control and without using those fundings, the threat of withholding that funding, to dictate speech on campus. That is now under direct assault by the Trump administration.
You know, I feel so sad for our chancellor because we we just became, it was a big push to become an R1 university, right?
Oh
Which is what
no.
you're talking about. And that has to do with getting
Right.
more grants and more federal funding. And the whole university worked its ass off. We made a big announcement last year, and now it's suddenly like, oh, that's the wrong thing to be. We got in the door on the R1 thing late, I guess.
Just at the wrong moment. Yeah, sadly.
I mean, I don't know how many university administrators I'm feeling too badly for these days because they're also, as a collective, really failing to stand up for shit at this point. But anyway, I'm sure we'll get to that. There are three parts, maybe, to the way that Trump is attacking universities: the funding, as you've mentioned, then intellectual freedom, and those two things tied, as you described, and a third involving eliminating or deporting foreign students, most of whom, as far as I can tell, are being targeted for their pro-Palestinian speech. So when you talk about funding, you mentioned attending a meeting at Yale. You described this in your essay, and you listened to, quote, a bracing description of the financial implications of the government edicts from the Trump administration. Like, what was mentioned in that meeting, and how do those things affect you?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, universities like Yale are concerned about three big things, just like not the three you just mentioned, but another three. I'm not supposed to say too much about what happened in that meeting, but I can say the big buckets that everyone is concerned about. The first is the federal government threatening to pull or pulling funding from what is largely medical and scientific research that it has historically given, right, and has actively actually promised to universities, as in the case of its announcement of pulling $400 million from Columbia a few weeks ago. The second bucket of concern is the proposed reduction of the reimbursement of what are called indirect costs to university research in the sciences. This went from a rate at Yale of something like 67% to a flat 15% nationwide. A flat fee doesn't really make sense because there's different overhead costs depending on what city you're in, et cetera. But the third category of change is the proposed endowment tax, or rather tax on endowment income, which appears to be underway. And if that goes through, we already have, in 2017, there was Trump passed an act that meant that endowments of certain types are now taxed at 1.4%. But last year, then Senator J.D. Vance suggested raising that to 35%. If that happens, that's going to take a big chunk out of universities' annual income. There's two things I want to just say about this, which is, first of all, indirect costs, when we talk about the change to the NIH, sounds really vague. And I think universities haven't explained them very well to the American people. So many people believe something like what Elon Musk tweeted when he said, like, can you believe these universities with these billion-dollar endowments are getting kind of a free ride on all these overhead costs? The reality is much more complicated. And one of the things that indirect costs do is allow us to conduct many kinds of research. And this really goes back to that Cold War goal of funding universities to basically create American, leadership in research and technology. The other thing to understand about the endowment tax is it's a tax on the income generated by the endowments, and it only is going to apply to universities, or currently only applies to universities that have an endowment of greater than $500,000 per student. So yeah, but those are the three buckets that everyone is concerned about.
Those indirect costs are a big deal. We got an email about it. I mean, it's not a big deal in the humanities, but for science and medical research, that's how they pay for their laboratory stuff, and for, I think, if I'm wrong about this, like grad students and assistantships and all that stuff, right? And people who are going to work in the labs who are grad students, which is how they pay for college. And so there's a whole system around this money.
Yeah, and I think to your point, like, this isn't public charity, right? Let's go back to that idea of the research university. We'll talk about this more, I know, but from the beginning, America has really invested in universities as a way of kind of tying knowledge production and national interest. We come out of the Cold War in 1945. Basically, this becomes a really big commitment, because when we do that science at Yale, we're discovering
guess who's not
things.
interested in the Cold War anymore?
Well, right.
Freaking administration now wouldn't fight the Cold War.
Totally. And I was talking about this with a historian who was saying, like, in a way, this is the real end of the Cold War. Like, we thought it ended a while ago, but like, this is this moment where we may be coming out of a moment, kind of an era rather, where we trusted in and kind of in a unified way believed in the goal of the research university and leaving it alone to do that work. Yeah.
I think that this Cold War framing is really helpful. And it's also interesting to think about what you say about this proposed endowment tax in light of, right? Like there is a line, some of which I believe in, where people are sort of like, well, universities don't spend their endowments, people sort of say, like save your money. Like so many institutions save their money for a rainy day. Like it's raining now. What are you saving for? And to kind of think about what might be down the line, even that could be like an escalation of what's currently going on is really helpful in disturbing context. Those indirect costs, I've been talking to my friends in the sciences about the ways that this kind of affects their labs and the different nuances of this. And they were talking about kind of like, right, the way that each school has a negotiated rate, and that it's much closer to, like, I don't know what the negotiated rate is at the University of Minnesota. I was just chatting about this with a scientist friend at a different institution over the weekend, and he was kind of unpacking this for me. But it seems like, yeah, like the idea that all of our institutions are the same and should be operating in the same way, or that sort of keeping the lights on is frippery of a sort is really ridiculous.
Well, there are so many examples. Yeah.
Yeah, and the other thing I think important to say, I've reported a lot on science for my book, The Invisible Kingdom, and I was actually in the middle of starting to write a piece about the NIH, maybe reforms needed for the NIH before this administration came along, and I may still do that. But one of the things you need to understand about the NIH too is that funding, right, is coming through. The NIH is incredibly onerous to deal with, right? There's all kinds of paperwork and rules and regulations and federal regulations that come with it. So some of those costs are even kind of generated by the fact that you're doing business not internally within your university, but with the federal government, right? So there's that piece too. And then, as you say, like keeping the lights on and having a space in New York City is really different from having it in, or in San Francisco is really different from even having it in New Haven is different from having it in Kansas. Yeah.
I just wanted to give an example, which is like there are many, many diseases that aren't financially remunerative for a public company like Pfizer or somebody to do research on, right? Because the numbers aren't right. There aren't enough people who have the problem, right? And the places where you get discoveries for things like that are in the universities, And then that creates a tremendous public benefit. I mean, our university system has been, it's the envy of the world up until now, I mean, people come here to study.
Yeah, it helped launch all kinds of things. Our space program, medical research, literary magazines, global diplomacy. I think our understandings of like radar come from university research, spending by the federal government. The internet came from DARPA, but a lot of other investments in the university have produced our greatest inventions and as you say, much of our science. Yeah.
You've mentioned endowments, right?
Yeah.
According to U.S. News and World Report, Yale had an endowment north of $40 billion in 2023. I mean, Yale's known for having a large endowment. And you would think that it would be uniquely insulated, right, from this. And yet you talk about, this is what we're talking about, right? This intertwining of the federal government and universities during the past century, how that's important, how that's led to discoveries and progress, really. So, I mean, we've already talked about this, but I wondered if you could read a section of your essay that sort of directly addresses this.
Yeah, sure. But can I explain a little bit about the endowment first? And this goes back to something Sugi was saying, because it's not just this, there's a really big misconception that people have, which is that the endowment is this kind of rainy day fund that we could just dip into at any time, especially when we need it. Well, there's a way in which and I don't have, by the way, I have not seen all the details of the Yale endowment, but I have an endowment for the Yale Review, the magazine that I run, that there's certain funds that I'm allowed to access. And what is really important to understand is that the endowment at a place like Yale, it's not one thing. It's not a fund waiting to be reached into, but rather a group of gifts from donors over a long time, often with quite specific parameters, right? The money of those and mandates, the money from those gifts is then invested. And the budget that you get is the income from that investment, right? So I have an endowment for the Yale Review. If I spend that endowment, I will soon no longer have any budget, right? Rather, my budget is the income generated by that endowment. Also, one of the things that kind of gets overlooked is that, you know, the key principle of endowments, as the organizational studies professor, I think her name is Elizabeth Pop Berman, and she's the author of a book called Creating the Market University, which is really interesting. She recently wrote that, you know, a condition of the gift usually is that it is held to generate future income. So you can't just go in and take it. Like I'm not allowed to take that. I can raise money that's called spendable money, right? So the big endowment of Yale means that it has a lot of income generated every year, and that sustains this huge breadth of the research in a university. But you're often not allowed to kind of seriously dip into that endowment. There might be little pockets where we could take money and plug it, and that's a big issue.
You can't spend the principal.
You can't spend the principal. And also there's something called generational neutrality, which is built in, which is that you can't do that because then you would harm the future, right? So every era thinks it's in a bad position. Like 5 years ago, COVID, we would have been like, oh my God, we need to spend the endowment. Vietnam War, we need to spend the endowment, whatever it is. So Yale, obviously, I think, you know, Yale is going to exist. But I'm really worried about places like UC, University of California, San Francisco, where they have a, you know, I think it's a $3 billion endowment, more or less. They do incredible research into HIV, long COVID, multiple sclerosis, genome editing. They're going to get hit really hard by these things if they go through. Okay, so then you asked me to read, sorry for that long answer, but it's really key, I think. So let me read a little piece of my piece for you. Okay. So this is the kind of history of the research university. For much of its history, the American university has stood at the intersection of knowledge production and national interest. The Morrill Act of 1862, which established land-grant universities, was one of the first federal efforts to expand access to higher education, aligning colleges with the needs of a growing industrial economy. In 1890, the second Morrill Act brought funding to historically Black colleges and universities and reinforced the idea that higher education was a public good, one that served not only individuals, but also the broader needs of the nation. But it was World War II and the Cold War that fundamentally transformed universities into engines of state power, binding research to military and technological supremacy. The war effort had demonstrated the strategic value of academic research. Universities played a crucial role in projects like the Manhattan Project and the development of radar, showing that scientific breakthroughs created by university research could determine military superiority. In 1945, Vannevar Bush, a key wartime science administrator, argued that the federal government should sustain this partnership in peacetime, leading to the creation of the National Science Foundation in 1950. By the way, they've had a lot of funding cuts. From then on, higher education was integral to American dominance on the global stage. By the 1960s, in the wake of Russia's launch of the Sputnik satellite, America was seized by a national fervor for scientific and technological education. Federal R&D funding skyrocketed, supporting not just engineering and military projects, but also the social sciences, humanities, and the arts. Universities became hubs of government-backed knowledge production. In 1957, funding from the National Science Foundation stood at $40 million. By 1968, it had climbed to nearly $500 million. These investments fueled space exploration, medical research, literary magazines, and global diplomacy, as I was saying earlier. The key is that knowledge in this era was not partisan. It was considered a national asset. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is all right. The reason that I have mixed feelings about every profession I've been in, from journalism to higher education, and also I love those things very much. And one of the reasons is that it's like, those are hard places to lie. Like the idea that like the truth is a national asset seems to be one of the things that's falling by the wayside, because I mean, universities for me were so important because they were places where I went to check the misapprehensions I had from other kinds of learning. And anyway, so now we have a partisan like Christopher Rufo, who you describe as a key architect of Trump's assault on universities. And he wants to use financial pressure to put universities into, quote, existential terror. So for those of our listeners who might not know who Christopher Rufo is, who is this guy? What are the supposed policies and problems in higher education that he wants so badly to change?
Yeah. I wanted to say, I love what you said about like, there's this kind of agreement about truth that we're maybe losing. And in this Yale faculty meeting that I was in, that was one of the really moving pieces, was this discussion of like, in the midst of all the chaos, one of the things they did was say, what are we? Like, what do we try to do? And one of the things is that we're committed to the mission. Higher education is committed to the mission that there are facts out there that we can agree on, right? There's much we must debate, and we want to hear that robust debate, and that's part of what's being stifled now. Okay, so Christopher Rufo, he is a former documentary filmmaker who felt he had experienced discrimination as a white man applying for grants, I believe, and became an anti-DEI crusader. As he recently wrote in his Substack, I think last week, he was like, equality should mean equality not just for minority groups, but for everyone. In many ways, he's the architect not only of this assault on higher education that we're seeing. He actually met with Trump at Mar-a-Lago right after Trump's re-election in order to discuss reforming higher ed. So he's been really, although he's not in the administration because he has not wanted to be, he's really influential in how it's doing what it's doing. But he's also the architect of this larger anti-woke campaign that we've seen from the right? He portrays his crusade as trying, and anti-woke being his language, as trying to return the university to the ideals of kind of true meritocracy and a non-ideological, what he sees as a non-ideological idea of truth, right? There's a lot of discussion about kind of returning to a kind of classical education, which is a view I find nostalgic, right? And there's ways in which it can look kind of simplistic, but he's very smart and he knows his enemy very well. He understands the weak parts and the things about academia that will play badly to the public. He's one of the people, he famously said at one point, the goal is to have something, if something crazy is in the newspaper, you want the public to immediately think, oh, that's because of critical race theory, right? So he's quite canny about translating or sort of mistranslating what the academy is doing to the public. And one thing that's really interesting is quite explicit and public about it. He doesn't hide. The day before the administration pulled the funding from Columbia, there was a podcast with Ross Douthat in the New York Times in which he said this thing about existential terror. He's like, our goal should be to make elite liberal universities feel this existential terror. And he's subsequently said, okay, Columbia is the first. Now let's do the rest. Yeah.
So he's a guy who sucked at making films and decided it was not his own fault, but somebody else's. And that was why people didn't like his films.
Yeah.
Because there's plenty of white guys making films.
I know. And I mean, I think to be part of what he wants to say and part of what people are saying, and part of when I published this piece, a lot of the mail I got that was from people in the center and the right who were trying to be reasonable. There's been a very successful kind of propaganda campaign to say that the last 40 years have seen the left kind of infiltrate and take over academia. And that has been portrayed as this kind of, where, Bret Stephens said recently in the New York Times that we're kind of training Marxist cadres, which I find hilarious because, like, let's look at most Yale graduates. What are they doing? Many are in like finance, others are in politics. Like, they're not Marxists.
All the true assholes in the Republican Party went to Ivy League schools, the fucks.
Exactly. But what is true at the same time, the reason they're so successful, right? And the reason there's actually a lot of support for what the Trump administration is doing, which seems like taking a hammer to a very delicate problem to me. Like, it's so clear to me this is not the way. But the reason there's a lot of support is that it is true that since 1998 in particular, what had been a somewhat politically balanced university now has moved much further to the left and to the liberal, politics. And one thing I read after my piece came out was a couple studies conducted at Yale by the Buckley Institute, which is a conservative institute, but surveying campus, and they found in 2024, so just last year, that 75% of Republican students feel they have to self-censor in class very or somewhat often, compared to 26% of Democrats and 47% of independents. Now, as an educator, I don't want that. I want people to be saying what they feel. the journalist in me would like to do a little follow-up, like, what is it that they're self-censoring? Like, what are the things you feel you can't say? Like, so, what would be wonderful is if we were not in this deeply partisan situation and we could actually have this conversation instead of just having the administration bring this kind of hammer down on what is really a delicate and I think very important set of institutions.
And we're going to talk a little bit about what role the left may or may not have played in like sort of free speech issues at universities. But I want to talk about this book that I read. I mentioned it earlier, The Closing of the American Mind by Alan Bloom, who taught at Yale at one point. And I feel like it was like the beginning of this critique, or at least one of the books that started this critique. And Bloom is like it's basically the TLDR on this is like, I don't like cultural relativism and I want to teach the canon only and stop trying to make me read books from other cultures or learn about other cultures because we just need to promote Western values and that's it. And everything else is bad. If I remember the book correctly, and I underlined it quite a bit as I went back and, okay, I have my old copy. So here, I'll read a quote from him. He's talking about teaching classes that involve studying other cultures or literature from Africa or literature from some other culture, right? And he's saying he's saying this in a negative way, okay? The point of these courses is to force students to recognize that there are other ways of thinking and that Western ways are not better. It's like, it's pretty clear what he's doing, right? And like that, I feel like that is the argument that has been coming through. Like, we want only one kind of culture to be taught, and the threat to like that Western canon idea, which was a big deal in the 80s, because look, people were breaking into the canon, people were teaching, Toni Morrison and whatever, and people are like, holy shit, what's happening? Well, okay, there are other great writers that actually need to be taught,
Yeah.
But I feel like the argument began there. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so I think, yes, Bloom, that book comes out, I think, in 1987, and that is really the beginning of the kind of the first battles of the culture wars, that what came to be known as the culture wars that we're in. When we take a broad view, as I did in my piece, we can see that the right has critiqued elite universities kind of from their instantiation as the Cold War university. We can think about McCarthy talking about pointy-headed intellectuals during the Red Scare, the hatred of hippie college protesters during whom Nixon sought to punish during Vietnam. Nixon almost did some of what Trump is doing, and then sort of also felt that to punish the research university would be cutting off our nose to spite our face, right? Because that generates so much value for America. But you're right. I think that we can more recently date this long war that we're in to Bloom, or even to 1987 when Jesse Jackson and 500 protesters marched around Stanford saying, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go, protesting Stanford's Intro to Humanities course, which was called Western Civilization or Western Cultures, I think, actually. And it did, in fact, and saying doesn't have enough diversity in this curriculum. And that curriculum changed to something like culture, values, and something. I can't remember, but that extends into the 90s when I was in college, and George H.W. Bush, kind of inveighing on campus about political correctness and saying there's a kind of bullying. The left says it cares about free speech, but they're bullying people on campus and they're shutting down discourse, right? Which is the precise talking point we hear Rufo and others saying today, that the left pretends to care about free speech and discourse, and they're going to fight, anyone doing anything that attacks free speech and academic freedom. Meanwhile, they are stifling free thought, in particular, the thought of conservatives on campus. So that this kind of culture war that starts with Bloom, Bush, and on the other side, Jackson, has definitely intensified, I would say, particularly in the past 10 years, around this new wave of wokeness and anti-wokeness discourse, and around Rufo and DEI in particular. Yeah.
It's interesting to think about this in context of, the ways that people you would think would be purportedly pro-free speech have worked to suppress pro-Palestinian speech at various university campuses, including mine, where I don't want to derail the entire conversation here, but I should say that last night, my university administration removed 5 pro-Palestinian statements from university websites. And I'm sure that this will continue to be a developing story over the next few days. And so by the time this episode comes out, listeners, more things will have happened. But I mean, the ways in which I mean, it's interesting because like listening to you, I'm sort of like, oh, like I don't know that I normally, right before all this, like would I have agreed with the notion that there is stifling of speech? And now, of course, like I very much do, like that there is this Palestine exception, and that many of the people who are supporting a Palestine exception would, in other contexts, have described themselves as, you know, people defending the free speech space of the university. And now, look at the, like, I don't want to describe it as a pickle because that seems so inadequate, but like maybe look at the shit show we're in.
Yeah.
And so I do want to mention the situation that is going on at my institution, where like the Board of Regents has been trying to, like, right, had passed a resolution to limit speech. The president has now taken this action. Like, I think that people have to stand up against this, because it's also, I mean, I think it's patently illegal, right? It's a violation of the rights of not only individual free speech on campus, but also right, collective speech, which is also protected and which is also under assault in this context. So
well, there's two things there too, which are free speech as it's protected in the Constitution, and then academic freedom. And
right.
I think actually, like, it's not necessarily illegal to say you're, as a department, you can't have a political statement, but punishing people's free speech by taking them and putting them, you know, in detention or prison. There's certainly an argument about whether you can do that to people with green cards. If you start doing that to citizens, that's definitely illegal. And certainly we're seeing this incredible encroachment of the federal governments. You know, what we've seen before is debates, but we have not ever, and we've, for all, you know, like, even if you wanted to grant Rufo and their critique that, okay, the left overreached, right? That's internal politics at a university. What we're seeing now, and that we have to really distinguish from anything that's happened before, is the federal government using the full force of its state power to say what people can and cannot say, right? And that, as you say, that's extending into universities in these complicated ways. But we had, you know, the interim attorney general saying to Georgetown University Law Center, it came to my attention, you're still teaching DEI, which doesn't quite make sense as syntax. If you do that, we're not going to hire your students, your graduates, which is blacklisting, and which is patently illegal, right? Yeah, sorry to just interrupt there. Yeah.
No. I think it's interesting because I have heard some persuasive arguments about the ways in which, for example, a collective speech via a department would be legally protected. But I would imagine that this debate will continue to go on.
Right. It's certainly complicated, and I'm not a legal expert, but I think that is a debate right now. Yeah, to be particular about it. Yeah.
Right. Like, I think right here it's being framed as like sort of a question of what is institutional speech, how is it disseminated, et cetera. Like, you know, does this have to do with research or doesn't it? Surprising gaps in people's understanding of who has expertise and who doesn't.
100%.
Yeah, so a lot of thoughts and feelings about that. But so there's a free speech activist named Greg Lukianoff, who is the author of a couple of books, The Coddling of the American Mind, which is 2018, and The Canceling of the American Mind, just 5 years later. And they're clearly
those sound less similar to a book we were just talking about.
Indeed. So these callbacks to Bloom. He's very critical of what the Trump administration is doing, but he's also critical of speech codes at universities and efforts to get students and professors fired or disciplined for unpopular opinions. And he mentions this case at Yale in 2015 involving Erica and Nicholas Christakis. And I wonder if you're familiar with that case, and you know, if you can talk a little bit more about how universities on the left have played a role in making knowledge partisan over, say, the past decade and change.
Yeah, I am familiar with that case. I actually wrote about it for the New Yorker at the time. And I think that case is often really misunderstood by centrists and the right, who feel very, I mean, I think sometimes I try to step back and think about this as if I were like a marriage counselor, right? And to apply the principles of like marriage counseling to, and actually of raising toddlers to American discourse, right? Because one of the principles of both is that like with toddlers, they're often saying irrational things, but you're supposed to slow down and like witness what they're saying, right? Just as you are in a relationship, you're not supposed to say you're supposed to say, I see that you feel I've overreached by blah, blah, blah. So sometimes I think one of the problems here is that no one is slowing down and listening, probably on both sides. This is a great example to me of the right getting very alarmed about something that I think is much more nuanced, which is to say, the Christakises were what were called, I think at the time, master. He was the master of a college, a residential college. So this was not something that happened in the classroom. This was something that happened in his role as a kind of like in loco parentis personal relationship to the students in that college. They're not just dormitories. They really are, like the university used to call them, the homes away from home, and they're supposed to be intimate. The master is supposed to like help students feel seen and valued and comfortable. And what had happened was that the university administration sent out a letter before Halloween saying, basically, Halloween is coming, use good judgment, don't wear something culturally offensive, right? And that what happened after that has been framed as a conflict between the freedom of speech and the right not to be discriminated against, but I think that leaves out all this context. So what then happens is that Erica Christakis, who is Nicholas's wife, was the associate master, defended the rights in a late night email sent after 12 a.m. Of students to wear offensive costumes at a Halloween party. And she was like, isn't the point of college to be a little bit offensive or something like that? And she said, those who are, if you're bothered by it, she said, you should just look away. So this outraged students, right? And they confronted them. And there was a very heated and kind of painful to watch video in which students really talk over Christakis. They won't listen to him. They yell at him. It gets very heated and kind of awful. But there's a way in which, like, the university was just emailing students to say, don't be a Halloween troll. And Erica Christakis was like, no, trolls have free speech rights, right? But which they do. But also, Christakis was in a kind of shepherd role to these students, and she was kind of blatantly ignoring the concerns of the students who were like, we feel discriminated about. We feel there's a whole long history of kind of, racism at Yale, and all of that just got swept to the side. And so it's hard for me not to see this as a kind of vicious cycle in which, elite institutions were allowing inequities to continue without fully addressing them. And then resentments built. And then when emotions flare up, we were like chastising those who were unhappy, right? And to me, that seems like a kind of failure of leadership on the part of Yale and the Christakises. Like, I think their job was to listen to these students and not just to have an abstract intellectual conversation by email at midnight, right? The question of like, has the left, it's something I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on. Like, how's the left, what was it like the past 5 years on campuses? I think the most challenging letters I've gotten, or challenging for me to think about, letters I've gotten since I wrote this piece is like, hey, but wasn't there kind of overreach on campus? Weren't there moments when people said something, centrists, professors or students said something on campus where they got kind of socially chastised, right? Again, I want to really distinguish and make sure we're knowing that the Trump government bringing down the full force of its power, legal and financial, on universities and individuals is not the same as some professors and students kind of socially chastising or shaming one another, right? These are two totally different things. That said, there is a sense. Yeah, go ahead.
I do think that the right is responding to what they perceive as having happened, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I'm not sure that, I think that it's worth at least listening to the possibility.
Marriage counseling, yes.
Yeah, that they had a point sometimes, I don't know. The Greg Lukianoff guy, I just listened to it, and I haven't read all of his stuff. I just recently listened to an interview with him at the Bulwark, sort of the center, like place where Bill Kristol is now. And, I just feel it's interesting to me. Anyway, that's a side issue on Bill Kristol. But, so I thought he made interesting points. I feel like some of the points I would disagree with, but he's like a universalist, like free speech champion, right? He'll represent anyone. It does seem to me like fairly. And so for him to say, like, it was difficult for me as to have him listen to him talk about the ways that free speech had not operated properly in like the last 10 years and feeling like his argument was that it had increased. And I was like, well, I'm willing to listen to that argument. It's not an argument that I would make,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I'm willing to listen to that
Yeah.
argument.
Well, I think, what's really interesting is I think it's fair to say, to be descriptive and to say, I would want to see evidence, but as a teacher and person on campus, there was, whether you think this is good or not, and I think it actually did have many downsides. When I was in college in the 1990s, there was this, like, let's argue about it. And there was a kind of like enjoyment or thrill in arguing with one another. Um, I've had occasions in the past 10 years where argument in the classroom really quickly turned into something else. It has happened once or twice in 10 years. And I think this is one of the really important things to understand, is that this portrait of like the left suppressing speech, this is a product of right-wing propaganda that has been launched 100%. That said, is it also maybe happening sometimes? Sure. They always take something where there's a kernel of truth and they do. What would it look for? None of that justifies what's going on, right?
Yeah,
And
no
also
one's saying
already,
that. No one's saying
right,
that.
and no one's saying that. And
But I think it's
also
interesting to think about the history of this.
It's interesting. And also I would say already there's a kind of cultural shift on campuses where in that Buckley Institute study that I talked about, in 2024, the students coming into Yale, many more of them care about defending free speech of all kinds than was true 8 years ago, I think. Right. And so I think some of this is just how culture moves and shifts. And also, as I was saying, there was these long held resentments and I think awareness of like huge structural hypocrisies, in particular kind of structural racism, that there was a kind of pretense that it had been dealt with and it hadn't been, right? And then all of that comes boiling up, and to some degree that's natural and inevitable, right? But yeah, anyway, Sugi, what do you think?
I mean, yeah, I think that what you're describing is like, I wanted to make that point about the ways in which, yeah, I mean, people also believe the story that they're told about universities as university has become less and less accessible to people, right? It's kind of like journalism, the way that fewer and fewer Americans have ever interacted with a journalist. And part of the reason for that is like the death of local journalism. And if you defund institutions and make them less accessible, then fewer people understand what they are. And the people who are doing the job of telling the story of what we do have been doing a worse job, constrained by various things, a terrible job. And we are also now, I will say another thing that's going on with the chilling of speech is like like we're also teaching in an era in which like, Turning Point USA or Campus Watch, or I mean, whatever all of their names are, like there's a culture of like surveillance also that has permeated campuses. And I mean, I come from like my parents grew up in a place where I think that culture permeated campuses for a long time. And I think that that's horrific. Right. Because I think the culture of argument that you're describing, in which I also grew up in, is a culture in which you were arguing for the sake of the ideas and not for most of the time, not for performance. You had the freedom to actually change your mind without being humiliated. And I think we also have a narrowing space for that. And so like now the room in which to be uncertain, is smaller and it's a shittier room. It looks more like a cell. And
social media too, right? I mean, I think, sometimes I had to do a talk before I wrote this piece about kind of civil discourse on campus, et cetera. And I actually think that a place we could all agree, probably, I mean, we all, not the three of us, but with those on the right whom we might not agree with on other things, but a kind of reasonable place to come to this is, I do think that one of the issues that no one's talking about adequately is that the students growing up on social media as a space of discourse means that they are already in a kind of public marketplace of ideas before they have any ideas or any skills and they're doing it while they're adolescents. And so they don't understand, when they come to universities, we have to kind of almost teach them how to be in a seminar room and how to allow discourse to unfold as a local place of thought. And I think in a way that's where the safe spaces discourse came from, is that they have this feeling of being unsafe that's from sort of huge structural changes that have happened in how they learn how to talk to one another. Anyway, that's a whole sidebar, but I think that's a huge issue.
Luke Yanoff's book might sound eventually as ridiculous as Alan Bloom's, because I do think, and I haven't read it, I need to read it, but I do know that the coddling of the American mind, like, is a part of his thesis is that like helicopter parenting led to this, and
Oh
you're
God, it's all
proposing
ridiculous.
okay.
No, I mean, I don't think that's true. I do think social media, like when we think about how to talk to one another, that is a paradigm shift has far-reaching effects. I mean, think about how we feel. Think about what it feels like to be disagreed with. I mean, there's so much research about how you're much ruder to one another. There's less empathy. You're also like in a state of heightened cortisol. I think students come to Yale or to UCSF or to Pitt, and they all have this like embodied history of like stress around discourse, right? And I think that's actually the thing that we should be talking about, like more than the helicopter parents or they're coddled. No, they've been exposed to like a different model of discourse in which they haven't learned how to have actually a safe space. And that's like a real issue. And that's maybe a way forward to think about together. I don't know.
That's really interesting. So we are now seeing all of this history playing out and sort of coalescing into a situation that has these really real human costs. There's like the horrific video of the tough student who was abducted off the street by masked ICE agents who don't seem to have identified themselves and really just look like thugs. I mean, we're not really sure what she was even taken for. We know that she was here on a student visa, that Marco Rubio revoked it, apparently based on her political views. The op-ed that she co-authored and signed has circulated widely. This past Thursday at the University of Minnesota, we had information that one of our graduate students had been detained by ICE. There's very little information about the reason for that. What kind of chilling effect is the situation of international students? Like the US has always been a haven for international students. We've always been famously welcoming of them. It has been one of our, like, to your point about the university as a national asset, like it is one of the major ways that we have attracted the best and brightest people from abroad.
Yeah, I want to
to our
piggyback on
country.
that. I mean, we don't have a
Yeah.
very large endowment here at UMKC, if any. I've never heard anybody talk about it. But I mean, and we also have endured lots of state funding cuts from the Republican legislature doesn't want to fund higher education. So one of the ways we pay for our schooling for Missourians is to get international students to come here and study, and they pay full
Wow.
tuition, right?
Right.
And that's
So
how
they're kind of
this works.
subsidizing American
They're
citizens. Yeah.
subsidizing the whole
Yeah.
project. Right. And now we're like,
Mhm.
but if you write anything in the paper, you're going to go to jail. And it's like, that's not going to work. People are not going to do this. That's going to break the model for how my university works.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that. Oh, Sugi, I mean, almost did not sleep at all the night after watching the Tufts video. I mean, that is absolutely chilling. I think not just for those of us on university campuses, but it should be chilling to any citizen of this country. I know there's some like legalistic debates about what you are and aren't allowed to do as a green card holder or person on a visa, but there's no reason that that person had to be abducted from the street by people wearing masks and behaving thuggishly and moved states when the judge said don't move her. I mean, the whole story is absolutely chilling and horrific. And honestly, I keep thinking back to, there was a really wonderful op-ed by M. Gesson in the New York Times saying, don't just care about what's happening to trans people or people on visas and green cards because because of the old, first they came for these people, then they come for me. Don't be upset because maybe they're going to come for us. Be upset because they're coming for them. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's just my starting point is that, one of the amazing, beautiful, challenging things about being a professor on a university is that we are teaching students in the classroom and we are also in this kind of in loco parentis role. And that's more true than ever. And there's a real sense of community on campus. There really is. There still is the sense of community in which we hold and care for one another across diverse viewpoints. And something like this it's of another level of loss and horror. And I think it's going to your point, is like, we're going to lose international students. Absolutely. I mean, I know all these people who are not coming. And then, by the way, we're already losing professors. And I was approached to go on TV to talk about how many European universities are starting to lure professors. And I was like, well, I'm lureable, like lure me. I think it's
Marcy
sort of terrifying. Marcy Shore, my colleagues,
show,
Marcy Shore, Tim Snyder, Jason Stanley, my neighbor lives down the street. They are all going to U Toronto. Yeah, so it's absolutely chilling, and it and I want to tie back to where we started with science and the NIH. It's also going to have a material impact on how we do science in this country. And I've talked to a lot of scientists, and we are losing a generation of scientists, and we will no longer be a leader in scientific research. And if you want to go to, a hospital to get cutting edge cancer research, well, that's not going to happen here anymore in the same way.
You're just going to have to drink bleach and kill it from the inside.
I mean,
a lot of vitamin A, apparently,
I mean, the other thing that my scientist friend who I was talking with this weekend pointed was, and that I've also been reading about is like, right, it's not just that it isn't going to happen here. Some of it is that like our funding was better here. And so it maybe isn't going to happen anywhere, right? It's not like it's moving. Right. It's not like it's moving. Right.
No,
so,
no.
I mean, it's
going to give tax cuts to to like high income earners. So, and it's eventually setting up this kind of oligarchy. It's intensifying the oligarchy that we already have. Like that is actually what it's doing.
Yeah. Well,
on that happy note,
on that dark note, I would like to say university was where I first got to spend tons of time with you. Trivia for our listeners, Meghan and I lived a floor apart during our year at Radcliffe, and it is so nice to get to see your face again.
We must get together.
That was really
and
fun.
Just to end on a lot of people say, what can we do, right? And I think the thing we can do is not become inured to this, and to really study what's happening and to really understand the factuality of it, right? Like we have our emotions, which are really important and need to guide us, but also to learn the laws, learn how the federal government works, learn where to put pressure, and to be in community. I mean, those are, I think, the things that I'm going to rely on to get through this, is talking to people, seeing your face, and learning as much as I can, and then speaking accurately as much as I can.
I called my congressman and asked him to speak out about the abduction at Tufts, and he did.
That's amazing. See, there's these little moments. There are these little moments. Yeah, but we need to do it. We need a concerted effort.
I think that is actually a much more hopeful place to end, in the sense that to feel agency about this, and to remember that that there is so much agency actually at universities. So Meghan, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a joy to see you and have you with us. And listeners, you can find Meghan's essay, The End of the University as We Know It, at the New York Times website. It will be located in our show notes as usual. And we encourage you to go check out her gorgeous books, including The Invisible Kingdom and The